Welcome to Tech Trends. Tech Trends is a podcast series that explores perspectives on the latest trends in technology, fintech, and digital. I'm Manish Bhimani, Chief Information Officer for Commercial Banking at JPMorgan Chase. And joining me today is George Sherman, CIO of our Global Technology Infrastructure Organization. And George is going to share with us best practices on instilling business resiliency during times of crises and during an uncertain time. George, welcome to Tech Trends.
Thank you for having me.
So a lot of noise and a lot of discussion around business resiliency. Some people call it business continuity, business resumption planning, other things like that. Let's start, for our listeners, what does business resiliency mean?
Well, I think it can, at the most fundamental level, it means staying in business, right? Being able to operate and function. I think the first question you have to ask yourself is, am I thinking about this as I want to be able to run my business and grow my business? Or is it really just about maintaining my business? To me, you have to kind of take those decisions up front. In both cases, it's about business resiliency. But the first one's more about like going concern, like really running the business. And the second one is just treading water, as it were, keeping the business alive.
So I think what you're saying is it's not really a one-size-fits-all kind of a concept, right? You might deal differently for a physical disaster or a technology issue, whatever. So what are some of the scenarios that you think about when you think about business resiliency?
Well, I try to get people to think about, disaster planning is always about the bad times. So if you think about, I had to, let's say, vacate a building, whether that be a building or people in, or a building where your technology is, or both. And I had to vacate that building because there was a gas leak outside. That's a very different situation than if the building went on fire and burnt to the ground. Okay. And if it went on fire and burned to the ground, you've got to think about your recovery plans very differently, right?
Yeah, that's interesting. I remember I think it was during Superstorm Sandy, we and many other firms sort of got through a lot of the heroics of individuals involved, right? And I think in a conversation we had is you want to aim at, sort of the long-term issue, because you can get by for a month just by people working much harder and doing other things like that. Whereas if you got a plan for 3, 6, 9, 12 months, you got to fundamentally think differently about the way you run things, right?
When I think about recovery during crisis and long-term versus short-term, I always think about our teams, to your point about heroics, right? You have to find a new normal quickly if you're going to survive the long haul. The fact of the matter is you have to rethink how your teams are going to be operating over that long-term period. In our first few weeks of this event, everyone was just 110%, making sure that we were ready to run our business, and yet you could see fatigue start setting in, right? And so we actually had to take some moments where we'd say, okay, it's 6 o'clock, 5 o'clock, whatever it was, your time zone, you have to log off, right?
Right. So let's talk about a little bit. We talk about various scenarios and planning for different things. You plan differently for a hurricane, then you do a loss of a building, then you do a technology issue, whatever. What are the top things that should be in everybody's playbook, if you will, for business resiliency?
So I think the very first thing, and this sounds a little funny sometimes when I say it out loud, is command and control. I think that the way you operate your business during normal times oftentimes is not how you'd want to lead and manage your business during a crisis. And the person who runs the business day to day during normal times may not be the best person to run the business during a crisis, or at least run the crisis, right? And I think it's super important to have that thought out in advance, and just be kind of honest with yourselves and say, who is best prepared? Maybe the person who deals with, outages and issues and customer issues and whatnot all the time is better suited to dealing with these types of situations. And then formalize that. And I don't mean it, yes, you can formalize it in words on paper, but you have to formalize it at the time of the crisis. So like I sent a note out to my whole organization explaining the command and control structure for my organization. Even though it was all written down and everyone knew what it was an explicit note to say, here's who's in charge, here's their second in command, here's who's responsible for this, their second in command, And we went through the whole roster. And surprisingly, I received a ton of notes from people saying how much they appreciated understanding that A, we were in charge, which during a crisis always is comforting that someone is in charge, and B, they understood how it was all going to work. I think the second thing is you have to have scenarios laid out. Mm-hmm. To the earlier part of this discussion, we were talking a bit about, it's different if you have gas leak outside your building versus if your building burns to the ground, versus a pandemic, right? All of these things have their own dynamics that you have to pivot to. And the more you can plan in advance for those scenarios, you can't think of everything, but if you pick those 2 or 3, I think you're in a much better field position when you're in the crisis to make the right decisions because you've already thought through it. I think the last thing is turning your resiliency practices into your normal practices as much as possible. So if your work area recovery practice is to send people home, right? Well then, and you're going to rely upon them using a laptop, let's say, when they get home. Well, then they should be using a laptop probably at work, okay? Or you should be sending them home on a regular basis to work from home.
So basically command and control, clarity of who's in charge, right? Scenario planning, and then regular testing, it sounds like what you're talking about, right? We talk about, or just make it part of your regular practice.
Testing, but make it as part of your business as possible. So if you're thinking about it from a technology perspective, if I had applications running in 2 data centers, one was doing all the work all the time and the other one was just sitting there waiting for a test, that's very different than saying every 3 months I'm going to switch what data center I'm running the application out of.
And that's an important point that you introduced to the firm a number of years ago, right? Which is, I remember a time when we would have we had the primary site and we had the disaster recovery site, right? And the disaster recovery site was exactly that. It sat around waiting for a disaster, got tested every so often. And then when push comes to shove and there's an actual issue, people are nervous about going over to the DR site because they don't know if it's going to work. Whereas now, it's not a primary and a DR. It's you got side A and you got side B. And every 3 months, side B becomes side A and side A becomes side B. And you just rotate back and forth. And I know a lot of firms that do that, and it really serves you very well, right?
It does. And in fact, we had to change the way we talked about it. So our older sites we talk about as primary and secondary, and our newer sites we talk as 1 and 2.
Yeah, right, exactly.
So that's the technical side, the back end side. On the people side, it's, as I said earlier, it's just making it part of your BAU. People ask me, how did I send home 8,000 to 10,000 people in my organization alone? And they function like there was not a blip. There was no blip. There was no issue. And the answer is most of my folks make changes to the environment on nights and weekends. And I don't ask them to come in the office on nights and weekends. So I let them work from home on nights and weekends. So all their technology worked, right? If you could see my technology set up here at home, it's quite impressive because I run my shop from here during the off hours when there's issues. And I think that making these things part of your business as usual as much as you can goes a really long way. And I think mobility leads to agility, right? And during a crisis, I think being agile is the most important attribute that you could have as an organization, right? Being so rigid that you can't pivot as the situation changes will serve you poorly. Okay, you need to be able to move. So if you can create an environment for your people where their technology can move with them, their business processes can move with them, and you can leverage technology like we are right now to stay connected and functioning, through the course of our day, well, then the more likely you are to be able to adapt to the changing scenarios and situations.
So George, we've talked a lot about business recovery, business resiliency plans. Yeah. Right. But life doesn't always go according to plan, right? I think it was the immortal philosopher Mike Tyson who said, everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the face, right? So how do you deal with when things don't go according to plan?
Well, again, it comes back to command and control. You have to have you have to take the information you can get at the moment, and you have to be prepared to make decisions against that information. And more importantly, I think you have to be prepared to change the decision if it was not a good one, which during a crisis is super important, right?
Right. So we've mentioned the pandemic a couple of times, obviously
Yeah.
very top of mind for everybody. We very quickly, as a, not just a company, but a society, went from everybody in the office to either shut down or everybody working remotely or anything like that in the span of days,
Yeah.
not weeks or months or anything like that too. Back to the how things go versus how you think you're going to go. What are some of the lessons you think we took from, in our case, getting 250,000 people to work from a resiliency site or from home or from another location, or getting the infrastructure stood up or any of those sort of things?
First of all, everything that's going on is so, impactful to all of us personally that it's important to pay attention to what's happening to the people around you, your customers, your clients, your employees, your peers, during such an event like this. And that became very apparent early on. Like, we had to look out for each other, right? Your concern over your physical health very quickly leads into concerns over your mental health. So you end up having to think about each other that way. And I think the second thing, I'd say was not, like, looking ahead and planning for the worst and hoping for the best was the right approach. Okay. In hindsight, it was the right approach. People would say to me, why are we ordering, let's say, certain circuits or whatever, or certain capabilities at the quantity that we were? And the answer was because we may need it. And as it turns out, we did. Had we have taken an overly optimistic view, who knows where we would have been. So I think it's super important as you go through this to think about, and what we learned is making sure looking after your teams and your people, and then also focusing on, if it does go wrong, how are we going to deal with it and getting ahead of that so that time is more on your side than not.
Right. How about from a technology perspective? Like I said, I don't think anybody had ever sort of envisioned building a plant where 100% of people or close to it are working remotely, right? You don't plan for that up ahead. How do you react quickly around that, or dealing with people's home infrastructure or things like that?
Sure. I think that I would say I was smiling when you're saying reacting quickly, because the reality of it is most of what worked really well for us are investments that we've made over the last 5 to 7 years, right? Investments in making people more mobile, investments in virtualizing their environments so that they could work from wherever they were, but it looked exactly like it did when they last used it. Really paid off during this scenario, this situation. And so that's the first thing. The second thing is we designed the environment to be able to scale. Now, of course, we were focusing on business volume based scale. We do have to deal with market events that can oftentimes stress capacities. And so, we made sure that as we designed components of the technology environment, we did so with the view of how easily would it be to double or quadruple or 10x the capability or the capacity. And then we would make thoughtful decisions about design and implementation to make it so that if we did say, hey, we got to double that or we got to quadruple that, it's not a year later that we're doing it. It's a matter of weeks, right? And maybe a few months to do it.
Yeah, it sounds like really what you're saying is if you plan for a mobile workforce, whatever that means, right? Assume that people aren't going to be in the office every day, much more mobile apps, much more remote connectivity, other things like that.
Right.
It serves you well, because even if they're in the office, you plan for mobile and you can shift to a more office-based environment. If you plan for office, you can't shift to a mobile environment as easily. Is that fair?
It's very fair. And I think that's more how the workforce is evolving anyhow over time, right? People want flexibility in how they work and where they work. And, maybe it's on this floor at that desk today, but tomorrow it's down the hall sitting next to someone else. And being able to do that and not always having to carry your technology with you is really the best model, or carrying the minimal amount of technology to gain access to a lot of technology, right?
Yeah, and I think it feels like you're starting to see the benefit of technologies that the industry's been talking about for the last number of years, whether that be virtualization, virtual desktops,
Right.
a lot of the cloud capabilities and able to scale quickly and other things like that. We've done a few podcasts
Yeah.
on the cloud.
Both public and private cloud capabilities have really paid off in this pandemic. Having access to compute on demand, whether it be external or internal, really changed the game, during this crisis.
Yeah. So when I think about it, actually gets to my next question, which is, well, how companies should think about technology resiliency or technology preparedness around, these sort of crises, right? So obviously planning for a much more mobile workforce, you
Mhm.
know, leveraging SaaS, software as a service providers, for things like email, for things like cloud, a lot of the core infrastructure. Um, and back to one of the earlier points you made, just making sure that you're constantly, testing these things, making sure they work, making it part of the regular,
Right.
fabric of the organization, right? Anything else you think people ought to keep in mind from a technology preparedness?
I think staying current is probably the next most important thing. One of the things we found out when we sent all these folks home is that oftentimes their home technologies have been neglected.
Yeah, I think that's a great point that you raise. I don't think we realized how dependent corporations would be on people's home Wi-Fi,
Right.
right? And I think we've all sort of rediscovered the value of a hardwired internet connection. Right? You sent a number of us home with 100-foot Ethernet cords that have been very, very useful for a lot of people.
That's my
Right?
number one thing when people call up and say they're having a problem is I make them put me on FaceTime and show me down their hallway to see where their router is and get them connected. And it turns out some of these little things make a big difference. They make
George, if you think about, and you touched on this before as well, a lot of the people that are watching and listening work for much smaller companies. Don't have the resources of a JPMorgan Chase or a large firm or anything else like that. What can they do to improve their resiliency?
Well, I think first of all, you have to make sure that you're working these plans into your day-to-day activities. If you think part of your plans are, a key part of your plans are to work from home, well, then I would strongly suggest that you work from home and you have your team rotate working from home on a regular basis, not like a test, but as part of their normal operating practices. The second thing I'd say is take advantage of some of the cloud technologies that are out there that support your ability to do business from really any location, whether those be customer relationship management technologies or storage technologies that allow you to access your files wherever you are. Those are ways in which you can, on a budget, become more agile and more mobile, which ultimately will help you during times of crisis.
Yeah, George, none of us could have foreseen COVID and the pandemic and everything that's coming with it. I think generally as an industry, we've reacted well to it, right? But there's a lot of lessons learned that have come out of that as well. So what lessons do you think people take from this in terms of how they're going to think about resiliency or even the way they work going forward?
I think the first lesson is the duration.
Mhm.
Um, this is already longer than most people would have planned for, I think, in most cases. And with the duration comes challenges, right? And so I think that going forward, we'll think more about what if you had to operate this way for an extended period of time, whatever that means, whether it be that you lost some back end system or data center, or you lost a building, or you have another pandemic. I think that's going to be the one thing that really changes in how we think about the future.
And finally, George, what's the role of a leader or a business owner during crises like this, right? Any advice you have to our listeners today about that?
Well, I think that it really comes down to making the decisions that preserve the health and well-being of the business, and while looking after the employees at the same time, and finding that balance. Again, over the long haul, it gets to be more challenging to find those balance points. But I think as the leader of the company, you're constantly trading off on, how do I preserve, how do I grow my business, how do I preserve my business, how do I operate my business And during a time of crisis, sometimes you have to go from I'm not going to grow to I'm going to preserve for a while.
Right.
And I'm going to get into more of a defensive position. And then when is it appropriate to come out of that defensive position and get into more of an offensive position and start to grow the business again? I really think that ends up being the role of the leader of the business as time goes on.
If you wanted our listeners to take one thing away from this conversation about business resiliency, what would it be?
Is agility. It's very simple. It's agility. And having that be part of your decision process throughout the course of your normal business. It's every time you make an investment, every time you take a strategy decision and walk it forward, think to yourself, how does this improve the agility of my business to withstand the rougher times, whether those be short or long duration? The more that that's done proactively, the better off they're going to be, and they're going to be able to react more effectively during crisis.
So don't wait for the crisis to be able to think about how you're going to deal with it, basically, is what you're saying.
Exactly.
George, thanks very much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's a lot of fun.
And to all of our listeners, thanks for joining us today. Remember, if you enjoyed this episode, you can subscribe and rate us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Tune in next time.